Hello, good evening, everybody. My name is Courtney Dahlgert. I'm the president of Network 2020. I just want to say, first of all, thank you to Ambassador Lee and to our friends at TECO. In particular, I want to thank Tiffany Chen and Karen Chu for all their help in organizing this event. Just a few quick words about Network 2020. We are a New York City-based nonprofit, and we're really dedicated to promoting informed conversations about global affairs. And so we do this both online through conversations that are free and open to everyone around the world, as well as to our members in New York. And we think it is critically important to have these informed, nuanced discussions about everything that is happening in the world right now, as including on Taiwan-US relations. We are in a very interesting moment where global power is quite fluid, where there seems to be shifting distributions of power, a questioning of traditional alliances. And so zooming in on the Taiwan-US relationship is a particularly important piece of that. And so I thank you all for coming tonight to be a part of that. And so I'll conclude just by turning this over to Isaac Stonefish, our moderator. He is the CEO and founder of Strategy Risks.
Thank you, Courtney, and thank you all for coming to what will be a very calm and staid conversation about an unchanging topic, US-Taiwan relations. So I'm going to, very brief introductions. David at CFR, Russell, Global Taiwan, both very, very sharp voices on geopolitics and the US-China, US-Taiwan relationship. I'm going to start with some level setting. So I struggle to describe the period that we're in. The best thing I can come up with is the pre-war period. It doesn't feel like World War III has started yet, but it's unclear whether or not, looking back several years or 10 years, this will be the beginning of a war, or that'll be the dog that didn't bark. David, let's start with you. What period are we in with the US and Taiwan and China?
Wow, that's a big question. Well, I think that I would just say more generally, I think we can clearly say that the post-Cold War era is over, the unipolar moment or the era of US primacy is over, and you've seen Secretary Rubio explicitly say that we're entering a more multipolar world and that the unipolar moment was a blip in history or an aberration. And so the question is, of course, I think as the United States retrenches in some sense, and you see what we call restrainers on the rise throughout the administration, how does it define its interests and how does it go about securing or pursuing those interests, and how does Taiwan fit into that? And I think that you have a very clear debate and a very contentious debate, but that's a good thing in this country about how Taiwan fits into that. And for some who you would say are more on the restrained side, they struggle to see how the United States has a critical or vital interest in defending Taiwan. They would view our interests much more traditionally as US primacy in the Western Hemisphere, preventing the rise of a peer competitor like China or Russia, but they believe that that can be done potentially without Taiwan. On the other hand, you see other people who still believe that, yes, you have an objective of preventing the rise of a peer to the United States, and China is our biggest threat with respect to that, and Taiwan is critical to the balance of power in Asia. And if Taiwan falls, and if China absorbs it through aggression or through coercion, then you have serious existential questions raised in Japan, South Korea, potentially Australia and the Philippines as well, about the durability of their alliances with the United States, whether the US commitment to their defense is credible. And here I would say that I think a lot of people try to draw a very clear-cut distinction between Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Of course, we have a treaty obligation to both of those countries, and we don't have a treaty obligation to Taiwan. We have the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act, which has commitments that we make to Taiwan, but it's not a treaty obligation. But all I would say in that whole conversation is that that's a very American conversation. When you go to Asia, when you speak to leaders in Tokyo or Seoul or Manila, you know, they're baffled that we make that kind of distinction. In my view, the leaders in Japan especially believe that we're on the hook for Taiwan's defense, and if the United States doesn't come through, then I think there will be real questions asked about whether they can rely on the United States. And this is a core interest, I would say, for Japan. So that maybe was a little bit more than what you asked for, but I think that we are in a moment where we're taking stock of what the US role in the world is fundamentally, how we should define our interests and pursue them, and I think that Taiwan is a big part of that conversation.
I'm going to ask it to you a little differently, Russell. Thank you, David. There's a worry that Trump sees the world in three different camps. There's the Western Hemisphere for America, there's Europe for Russia, and then China gets to dominate Asia. And that would mean that Taiwan is not a country that the United States would be willing to defend. How do you make the case to US policymakers and to the US people today that Taiwan is a clear and core and important interest of the United States?
Well, Isaac, I thought you were going to let me off the hook when you asked Dave the first question, but I guess not. Look, I think to also address the first question that you presented to Dave, I think we are at a critical inflection point in this geopolitical world. And the reason for that is primarily because of the rise of the People's Republic of China and its increasingly aggressive assertion of its power, of its influence to reshape the international order in ways that favors its strategic interests. And that strategic interest runs fundamentally counter to the rule-based order that we exist in. And for that reason, I think there's been a fundamental change in the US sort of political environment where there is an emerging, I think, agreement, I think consensus perhaps may be too strong of a word, on the need to strategically compete against China for the very reason of the recognition that the long-standing assumption that China was going to somehow sign up to become a responsible stakeholder never panned out the way that people wanted to believe it to be. And so much of policy for the last 2 decades have been premised on a hope that China could become more like the rest. And as a result of that fundamental misunderstanding or misperception, I think we're starting to see a course correction that started, I would arguably say, within the last decade. And you've seen that continue between different administrations, Republican and Democrat. So this isn't a partisan conversation, it is a bipartisan conversation. And I think that reflects one of the fundamental core elements of this sort of inflection point that we are witnessing, because not only is it that China is seeking to change order, it is also that the other great power, the United States, is also recognizing that this is a threat and that it needs to rally its allies and partners. I see the sort of the framing of the three camps a little bit differently for the very reason that I think that, again, different administrations, Republican and Democrat, including, I believe, that President Trump, sees China differently than, say, Russia or other sort of strategic competitors of the United States. And I think this is reflected in some of the structural variables that exist in the bilateral relationship, where we have seen, let's not forget, this isn't President Trump's first administration. He had been in the White House before, and we saw at that point, the approaches that he had taken, and that's the only empirical basis I think that we have to really make a judgment as to what we might expect President Trump's sort of perceptions and his beliefs are, which, again, very little, has been publicly made to give us I think, a reasonable justification to assert that, that this is in fact, his views on the matter. But what his administration has done, at least in terms of really putting the United States in a strategic footing to compete with both the ideological component of the PRC's competitive approach, to the economic approach and the security approaches are, I think, telling. in terms of how this administration, this Trump administration, will approach this in this second term.
So the global sands are shifting. Two-part question for both of you. What misconceptions do you see about US-Taiwan relationship, and what signals are you looking for of what may come over the next couple months that will tell you clearly one way or the other the direction things are going?
Well, sure, I'll jump on that one, Dave. But look, I think this is a very appropriate time to have this conversation. We're just weeks away from the 46th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act, right? Dave referenced this earlier. You know, it is a very unique legislation in the US policy context. I'm not aware of any other sort of domestic legislations that, you know, really, sort of stipulate the terms of our engagements, with a foreign entity. And that has enabled enduring legal framework for peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, for over 4 decades. And I think that there are some enduring qualities in that legislation and how it's been implemented successively by different administrations in the defense and security realm, in the economic space, in the international space, as well as the people-to-people space. And I think I will group these interactions in these 4 different clusters, and I would observe these developments to assess, the degree to which any administration's efforts to advance a bilateral relationship is, moving forward or not. And so, I will look in terms of, the administration's, willingness to, live up to the obligations of the terms of the Taiwan Relations Act to provide defensive articles and services to Taiwan, in supporting, its greater economic and cultural and other relations, and supporting its international space. I think successive legislations that help to reinforce the Taiwan Relations Act, all sort of premised on the Taiwan Relations Act, have included provisions that the importance of supporting Taiwan's international space is part and parcel of ensuring peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And I think we saw that both in the first Trump administration to the continued onwards in the Biden administration. And I expect that, we'll see more of that in the second administration as well.
So one misconception, and I think that it's dominated conversations, especially in the last month or so, is about the role of chips in the US-Taiwan relationship. And so I would address this on 3 different levels. I think on the first side, there's the misperception, in my view, that China wants Taiwan for chips, that's driving Chinese strategy. It's why Xi Jinping has a hunger for Taiwan, and it's what might actually prompt him to roll the dice one day in an attempt to absorb Taiwan's chip-making prowess into China. I've never been in a conversation with Chinese interlocutors where they've mentioned chips to me. Of course, they've wanted Taiwan since before chips were invented, and even without TSMC, they would want Taiwan all the same. And then I would also say for US-Taiwan relations, I think there's a misperception that our relationship is all about chips. And it's easy to get that, to believe that when TSMC is announcing a $100 billion investment into the United States, which is, it has been touting as the largest single investment in this country in our history. And when you have a lot of talk about how much NVIDIA, Apple, and others rely on TSMC to make any of their products work. But again, if we were to talk about the Taiwan Relations Act that Russell just mentioned, that was passed and signed into law before Taiwan manufactured chips. And we have enduring strategic interests, even if we have somehow down the road a self-reliance in chips and we're able to make chips in Arizona, for instance, rather than importing them from Taiwan. So I think that we do everybody a disservice when we only talk about chips and believe that we care about Taiwan because of chips. China cares about Taiwan because of chips. And I think that that's clearly not the case. In terms of what I'm looking for, I think that the elephant in the room is what happens when President Trump meets Xi Jinping. And Trump has said already that that might happen as soon as April or May. We know, I believe, that Trump wants a deal with China, at least on trade issues. He's repeatedly spoken about that. I think that the tariffs levied on China is a tool that he believes give him leverage in such negotiations. And the real question here is whether the Chinese or the Trump administration decide that it's in their interest to try to expand the scope of the negotiation, to get beyond trade, to thinking about technology and export controls and potentially geopolitical issues, whether that's Russia, Ukraine, the Korean Peninsula, or potentially, South China Sea, Taiwan. I think that how we get out of that first interaction is going to say a lot about where this administration is going on China policy and on policy towards Taiwan, and that's really the first inflection point.
I think that's an excellent point. I do think people have that strong misconception that this is all about TSMC, and I think if you could get a list from Xi Jinping on the top 20 reasons why he'd like to seize Taiwan, TSMC is probably 16. So I'm very pessimistic about where things are going, and my reasonable nightmare scenario is Trump and Xi strike a deal. Xi doesn't believe the deal, so he pushes a bit, maybe seizes Kinmen or Matsu, a la Russia in 2014, Crimea. The US doesn't respond forcefully enough, and then China invades Taiwan in, say, several years. I think 2027 is a silly concept. Beijing will invade tomorrow or never, or in 2027 or in 2030, based on a lot of different factors that don't have to do with numerology. I do feel, however, that if the US doesn't show resolve on a small push, it could lead to the full invasion and a potential war. None of us can predict the future. It'd be lovely if we could. I think to Biff and Back to the Future and coming with a concrete stock picking and knowing all of the sports games, who's going to win, who's going to lose, knowing we don't have that insight. However, it does feel like things are potentially moving in that direction. And not to put either of you more on the spot than I have through my earlier questions, but do you think Trump will end his term before China invades Taiwan?
So I think yes. I think that, I think and hope, but I also do think for a set of reasons that we'll be able to get through the next, 3.5 to 4 years for a few reasons. I think that the offshore islands bit is, it's tempting to think about in your head and to think that it puts us in a very difficult position. But I think that number one, there's a political reason not to take the offshore islands, which is that they're the only territory of the, quote, Republic of China that's not part of Taiwan province. So that's a link of Taiwan to the idea of the Republic of China. And if the PRC severs that, then that's actually taking away a historical linkage there that could do itself more harm than good. And my own view is that actually, if the PRC were to seize an offshore island or even, Ituaba in the South China Sea, for instance, these were not covered in our US ROC Mutual Defense Treaty. So it wasn't even under that umbrella when we did have a commitment to defend Taiwan, the main island of Taiwan. But I do believe that the US wakes up the next day and formally and firmly commits to defend Taiwan. Because I think that would be the lesson that we learned from Crimea, as you put it, is that you have to then make clear your resolve and your commitment and draw a line somewhere after that. So I'm not as worried about the offshore islands. The thing that I've heard, about President Trump, which I think is fairly persuasive to me, and I hope it persuades Xi Jinping, is that Trump can say a bunch of things today and tomorrow and question, for instance, Taiwan and its its importance to the United States. But I think that we're all pretty confident that he hates being humiliated, and that he would view Xi Jinping using aggression against Taiwan as a personal humiliation and a question of his manhood almost, and that he would feel a need to respond. And so what I point to is that, President Trump has on multiple occasions said, Putin would have never invaded Ukraine if I was president. He respects me, he never respected Biden. So I think that psychology is still at play here. And so if Xi Jinping is going to make a move, I think he has to be fairly certain that the United States is not going to intervene. But Trump has pretty explicitly embraced the madman theory. I think he's commented in public about that. And so, you know, I think that that's still a question mark that Xi Jinping can't really put to bed right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dave gave an excellent answer to your question, but I think I would just add that I think the 2027 sort of timeline is a capabilities-based timeline that everyone seems to reference and forget the fact that this is not a judgment on Xi Jinping's intention to invade Taiwan, but a directive for his military to develop the capabilities to do so. And whether that, that assessment of whether or not he decides to do that will be based on a lot of conditions, political conditions, military conditions that I think are going to be very complex and nuanced, and a decision that will not be made very lightly. And that in the interim, the most important thing that we can focus on is ensuring deterrence. And that is going to be key to ensuring that those first steps are not made, and that we can forestall any future sort of attempts to destabilize and change the status quo. And so I think rather than focusing on that potential future date, more importantly is really focusing efforts right now, both here in the United States, in Taiwan, amongst allies and partners, to be able to more collectively enhance our respective capabilities to deter Beijing from engaging in that very dangerous military activity.
So I think we all know both intellectually and instinctively how different things are under Trump than under Biden. We have a lot of senior diplomatic representatives. That's a nice understatement there. A lot of senior diplomatic representatives in the audience tonight, and both of you are very savvy observers, and one could even say practitioners in this art. What would you recommend, either as practice or as a way of thinking, of interfacing with folks in the Trump administration, and how would you say that differs from the advice you'd give 3 to 6 months ago?
I mean, I'll start. I mean, I think that one of the clear differences that you've seen is that President Biden framed this era as a competition between democracy and authoritarianism, or democracy and autocracy. And he was somebody who believed in promoting those ideals and those abstract concepts. He's somebody who believed in things like international order and norms around sovereignty and territorial aggression and things like that. And I don't think that Trump cares about essentially any of that. And so, Taiwan has changed, I think, its public kind of posture around why the United States should care about Taiwan. President Tsai echoed what Biden said very often, that Taiwan was on the front lines of that global contest between democracy and autocracy. She calculated that that was the best way to win over the Biden administration's support and to make that pitch for why Taiwan matters. And I think that, in the beginning of the Trump administration, the Lai administration continued to talk that way, but it has clearly pulled back on that. And I think that the proposition that countries have to make to the Trump administration is much more about, why their future and why the bilateral relationship, affects U.S. security and prosperity. And we talk about the transactional nature of Trump repeatedly, but these all have to be seen, I think, as a series of transactions. If Taiwan does X for the United States will do Y for Taiwan, and why that helps both of them out. And I think that that's how every country has to approach the administration, because saying that we are going to help you defend democracy around the world and we're going to help you uphold the norm against territorial conquest, I don't think that that really registers.
Yeah, I mean, I think this administration cares about concrete results, tangible concrete results. and it has to be framed in the logic of what is in U.S. strategic interest. And that can align very well with other countries' interests as well, and I think it's not a zero-sum sort of framework. So the need to be able to articulate your interest in the framework of why is it in U.S. strategic interest to engage on these economic, political, or security matters will have to be the sort of the lead into any efforts to engage this administration. It's not going to be the broader sort of sort of ideational and values-based sort of foreign policy framework that permeated the former administration's efforts to sort of to rally the international community. This is going to be about, well, how does your interests fit U.S. strategic interests in ensuring that the United States security, prosperity, and stability is ensured. So, and I think that's going to be really the sort of motivational factors that are going to contribute to any successful attempts to articulate the interest of your respective countries' efforts to engage the United States.
I think those are really excellent points. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. So, Russell, I think you and I might have met for the first time when I was doing reporting on Beijing's influence in the United States and self-censorship and the ways that American corporations and entities would, bend for Beijing. The landscape in the States looks very different now than it did several years ago, and especially 10 years ago. And I'd love to hear from both of you your sense of the debate, so to speak, and the freedom of speech question vis-a-vis China. I know there's been a lot discussed with that with Trump. I wonder if now, because people are more willing to talk about China as a threat or a potential threat and talk more explicitly about Chinese business as a problem as opposed to just a solution, if you feel like in academic institutions, in the government and universities, that's shifted pretty drastically, or if you feel like you still see some of those problems.
Well, my sense is that there's been a sea change in public attitudes, both in rhetoric as well as action that has been taken over in the last, 8 to 10 years, in addressing the malign influence threat posed by the People's Republic of China. It used to be the case that there were only a handful of people that were actually even raising the concerns about the influence that, PRC Capital, CCP, agents, different sort of associations and groups that basically work on the behest of the People's Republic of China, operating freely and obscuring their ties with the the Chinese government. And I think that as you rightly pointed out and have done so in a lot of your work in exposing how these influence measures actually have an impact in how we, corporations, businesses, individuals engage with our institutions was, I think, very instrumental in helping to raise awareness about this issue so that it can get talked about in a public forum so that people can have the awareness to be able to then make their own informed decisions to address this issue. So I think we are making a lot of good progress in highlighting these issues, but I don't think we're nearly there yet. My sense is that some of these institutions that were created or reinvigorated to compete in this information space have been unfortunately been sidelined in these in other sort of efforts to address other governmental governance issues. And I think right now at this pivotal point where we are in this, again, global competitive information battle with the People's Republic of China, this is not the time to be sort of undoing some of these, I think, very important efforts to address this concern, both at a governmental level, but even more so at a public civil society level, because that part of the conversation is absolutely essential to ensuring that any efforts to address malign influence from any country would be absolutely essential to ensuring its sustainability and long-term durability. And the informed citizenry is vital to that effort.
Yeah, I mean, the whole debate has shifted quite rapidly, and I think in an unprecedented way. I mean, it was, it's hard to imagine that at the end of the Obama administration, we were having strategic and economic dialogues with China and negotiating a bilateral investment treaty with a small negative list. And here we are today, and we're banning potentially outbound investment to China, and also having a quite rigorous screening process for inbound investment for China. And it seems like that's, it's hard to reconcile that was only, 8 years ago, right? And so I don't think that there's any major foreign policy issue for the United States that has shifted, to such an extent in such a short period of time. Yes, as Russell said, there's been a lot of progress, I think, here. There's been a lot more education, a lot more awareness about the challenge and the threats that China poses. But I think, as Russell said as well, this is not, this isn't the time to stop those efforts. And I think that one thing that I'm worried about is that we are taking away a lot of the tools that we need to counter this. I mean, just today there was the reported 10% cut to BIS, which is the entity that reviews and actually enforces all these export controls on the Chinese. And so, we can talk a big game about cutting off China from the advanced technologies that it needs to fuel its military industrialization and develop capabilities that target the United States and target our military. But if we're not going to put our money where our mouth is and fund these efforts, then I think it is really concerning.
All right, so I'm going to open it up for questions. 2 points on questions. First, please briefly introduce yourself with the question. Second, a reminder that a question is a short statement followed by a question mark.
Hello. Oh, sorry. John Sudworth from the BBC. Thank you very much for the discussion so far. Fascinating. Brief question from me. Over the past few years, there's been a long-running debate about when China might have the capability to invade Taiwan. Where do you stand on that balance of strategic forces? And if we take it as a given that if it could, it would, what sort of missteps would it take from this administration to precipitate that kind of a crisis? For example, would it be enough for Donald Trump to suggest that he didn't care? Would that in itself be enough to trigger a war?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on what scenarios you're referring to what PLA capabilities have. I mean, they are developing their capabilities rapidly with enormous investments year on year. And that military balance is tilting increasingly in favor of China. And so what's key right now for deterrence is both not only ensuring that the U.S. military, but allied capabilities are developing rapidly enough to counter that. But also, I think we also need to take a more holistic view in terms of deterrence, because oftentimes we're thinking about deterrence in a very narrow fashion, either in dollar terms, in terms of investments in military spending. We got to think about. I think it's important in the context of cross-strait relations to look at it within a political context also as well, because it is within that political context that cross-strait relations operates in. And there are steps, I think, that can be taken at a political level that can also strengthen deterrence against the PRC. So steps that could be, that would precipitate that. Look, the President Trump's recent statement made some news with regards to his views as to on strategic ambiguity. It was taken as a sort of a step towards, potentially provoking Beijing to act because of the perceived lack of commitment on the part of the president to, act in response to a military invasion of Taiwan. But people tend to have forgotten that, that's actually a position that has been traditionally taken by the United States to not explicitly commit to whether or not it would invade in any situation with regards to a military conflict over Taiwan, and that has at least managed to keep the peace over the last 46 and more years. One could arguably say that we are approaching a situation where that approach may eventually outlive its utility, but I think with a balance of both military and political, as well as economic measures, there are, I think, steps that can be taken to tip the balance of deterrence in favor of ensuring that Beijing does not roll the iron die to engage in military conflict over Taiwan.
So I'll just add two things to that. I think that the way that I think about the 2027 capabilities timeline that Xi Jinping has put forward, that Russell mentioned earlier, Bill Burns, when he was director of the CIA, confirmed that the United States knows as a matter of intelligence that is a capabilities timeline, so we should believe that is true. My fear is less about whether the PRC will have the capability, because we can do things that alter that calculus and that make it much more difficult for the PRC to have a capability it believes in. My fear is more that in China's system, the way that Xi Jinping has personalized power around him, the way that he has removed people at very high levels in the CMC now, who is going to stand up and say, we can't do it, we don't have the capability? So my fear is that when the calendar turns to 2027 and Xi Jinping says, can we do it? The answer is invariably going to be yes, of course we can. And I think that's also a lesson that we learned from the invasion of Ukraine, is that we believed Putin couldn't do it. We were pretty sure he couldn't do it. Bill Burns flew to Moscow and told Putin that we've seen the war plans and he can't do it. But he never believed that. And so how confident are we that we can actually convince Xi Jinping that all of the generals and admirals are lying to him, and that actually they don't have those capabilities, when I think the information that he will be getting fed is, you've invested hundreds of billions of dollars into the PLA. We have all these shiny new capabilities. Who's going to tell him that they still can't do it after all this time? So that's my fear. In terms of, the other point I would add to what Russell says is that, the U.S. side of the coin, I think, is decisive. But Taiwan also gets a vote, and Taiwan can do a lot more to also show Xi Jinping that he can't gobble it up, even if the United States doesn't come to its aid. And so, extending mandatory conscription to 1 year was a good first step. Increasing defense spending, as Ambassador Lee said, to 3% of GDP is another good step. Taiwan is unveiling, I think it was just today, a new, unmanned drone for the seas that can target PLA vessels. So there are innovative capabilities that Taiwan can unveil: drones, other unmanned, uncrewed systems, missiles, hardening its society in terms of cyber and other resilience. And I think that also will play a role in Xi Jinping's thinking. So, yes, there's the question of what President Trump will say or do, what the U.S. force posture will look like in Asia, but also Taiwan, isn't just standing by. I think that there's a lot that Taiwan can do, that is doing, and that they can do more of to also affect that.
Good evening. My name is Inja. I'm first year Columbia CPA student. It's a pleasure to be here. My question is, how did you assess the importance of Senator Marco Rubio and advisor Mike Waltz in cross-strait or China affairs? Because given the current situation, they seem to be silent in foreign policy making. And how do you see their importance in the future?
I'll jump in on this one first, but look, I think one of the factors that assures me as an observer of this administration with regards to its policy approach to Taiwan and more broadly Indo-Pacific security issues are the I think important people in key places within the national security establishment that when they were not in their current positions have expressed views that I think reflect a clear-eyed understanding about the threats presented by the People's Republic of China, about the importance of supporting allies and partners, and the need to remain firm in the face of authoritarian aggression. And I think individuals like Senator Rubio, who is now the Secretary of State, as well as National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, are individuals who have, I think, that very clear understanding about the long-term strategic threat presented by the People's Republic of China. And so, to what extent, to your latter question, to what extent, their influence, that is, of course, an issue that is difficult to gauge in any, in this forum. But nevertheless, I think they have, that this is just as how the first Trump administration took action that I think overall was supportive of building a more robust U.S.-Taiwan relationship in spite of our own, in spite of the President Trump's own lack of public comments on these matters, I think also reflects well to the fact that as long as there are, to the extent that personnel is policy, the fact that there are people like National Security Mike Waltz, Advisor Mike Waltz, and Secretary Rubio in those key positions representing the United States' interests on these matters is, I think, an important matter.
One area where I perhaps have too much optimism is the belief that once Elon Musk falls from power, Secretary Rubio will be able to more enforce a lot of the policies that he would like to vis-a-vis Taiwan and China.
Thank you, sir. I'm a reporter from NTD TV, and I come from mainland China. I know the Communist Party is afraid of the truth. For half of Chinese, they don't know how evil the Communist Party is. Some of them think the Communist Party stands for justice. And still, the Communist Party is buying support from Americans' company to support their internet available. So we Chinese have no way to get the truth. For the 20 years, more than millions of Chinese have cost their lives to give the truth, to give freedom and truth, democracy, the beliefs to our Chinese. Millions of them cost their lives. So is it a good way to help Chinese people to overturn the Communist Party? I think it's better than war.
Great. So I'm tempted to turn that to the diplomatic audience, but I won't. So who wants to talk about overturning the Communist Party?
Well, look, I think, I think the most important thing that we can do right now is to maintain the momentum in underscoring the nature of the Chinese Communist regime, the real sort of ideological motivation behind their actions, and how that system is fundamentally incompatible with the liberal democratic system that we exist in. And by doing so, ensuring that the actions that they take and the organizations that are engaged in these types of malign influence activities that are affecting our societies, affecting our democratic way of lives in real terms, will, I think, provide for the basis in which there will be a greater understanding of why the Chinese Communist Party is its very nature is a threat to our system and our way of life. And I think that is where I would go with addressing the question of to what extent the Chinese Communist Party is viable in the longer term.
So I can save you, David, from this one. Two quick thoughts on that. One, I think it's important to emphasize the difference between Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party. And like opposing the party and opposing the Chinese people is a radically different idea, and making sure that we have those two things as distinctions. The other point is we don't know, let's say you could wave a wand and the Communist Party loses power. We don't know if what follows it is better or worse. It's impossible to say. I mean, even maybe North Korea is a more extreme example, whereas if Kim Jong-un falls, 50-50, he's going to be replaced by someone better or worse. There are no alternative power sources in China. The party dominates everything important and has its tentacles into almost every aspect of life. And so getting rid of the Communist Party doesn't then automatically create a free China. It might create a period of chaos, or almost certainly will create a period of chaos and instability. And I'm mindful that that's the same argument that the party makes. And part of their justification is, oh, without us, there is chaos. But they've done such a good job of entrenching themselves into almost every facet of Chinese life that I think they're right on that statement.
Gentlemen, thank you all so much for being here. My name is David. I do business development for American manufacturing companies. My question is, in 2024, the Chinese population declined, I think it's for the third consecutive year. And I don't know if this is any of your purview, but do you see China's demographic decline creating any long-term constraints on its economic and military capabilities? And if so, how do the US and Taiwan factor that into their strategic planning?
That's a great question. I think David, do you want, one quick observation that I would just throw out there as a reaction to that, to the trend line, is that how willing would Chinese mothers and fathers be to send their kids to battle in the future, and what that cost would be for the Chinese Communist Party to have to make that decision? How destabilizing would it be for them to have to make that call? It would be, I think, a very costly decision.
Yeah, I'll add maybe a slightly different take, which is that, China has 1.3 billion people. The people that they would be sending to this fight are not the educated Shanghainese and Beijingers who could threaten the Chinese Communist Party's grip on power. I think that we've learned a lot, again, and the analogy maybe only goes so far, but I mean, I think that everybody has been quite shocked at the casualties Russia has been able to sustain in Ukraine. And if you said that Putin would still be in power today with 600,000 Russians dead, of a much smaller population, obviously, than China, it's quite astounding. And I think one of the things that we've seen, I mean, I've spoken to foreign interlocutors who've actually been to Moscow recently. They said if you were dropped into Moscow and had no idea what time it was, you wouldn't even know this country was at war. It's completely untouched because Muscovites are not out there fighting. They're able to get the goods that they want and need. The regime takes care of them, and I think you would have something very similar in China. I think that the people who would get sent off are people from rural villages, conscripts who don't really have much else to do, and I think that the educated urban population they would attempt to shield from this. So I actually think that I don't put much weight in the demographic decline and think therefore China's going to say, well, we're already shrinking as a population. I couldn't think of going to war and losing more people, especially with the one-child policy, and mothers would be losing their only son. I don't take much solace in that personally.
Hi, thank you. My name is Eva Fu. I'm a reporter for the Epoch Times. So I want to ask a question about the United Front operations. I think both the US and Taiwan have recently been expressing concerns about the ability of Chinese United Front operations to do sabotage from within. And Taiwan recently has been expelling social media influencers for their pro-mainland China speeches online. So I'm wondering if you see any potential for both Taiwan and the US to work on this front together to counter such influence operations?
I think that there's been, significant growth in the areas where the United States and Taiwan are cooperating, and this is an area where countering disinformation, countering malign influence are growing with greater cooperation between researchers and civil society organizations, information sharing between law enforcement authorities and other national security apparatuses that are enhancing, our respective capabilities to identify and apprehend, these actors. And this is where an area where I think not only the United States, but other countries throughout the world facing similar challenges, not just the United States and Taiwan facing the threat from CCP malign influence, other countries as well. And where there can be a lot of lessons learned and shared to, again, close loopholes within our legal frameworks, because first and foremost, this has to be addressed through a legal framework within our respective systems. So it does require greater enforcement capacity as well as prosecutorial capacity to address these issues within our systems of and rule of law. And being able to also promote greater understanding and public understanding among the various our populations to understand this threat. Because in one respect, the greatest sort of countermeasure to addressing these malign influence is greater transparency, right? And you'd be able to ensure that, again, that people have a more informed public understanding about these matters so that we can address this. And this is a threat that's going to grow over time. Just this year, Taiwan's national security apparatuses have unveiled information that relates to the increases of individuals prosecuted for espionage from the PRC. And there's been a significant increase in the numbers from 2023 to 2024, 112 individuals. If you put that number into perspective, between 2006 and 2016, there were just over 40 of these individuals that have been prosecuted for espionage-related crimes. And so, there's multiple ways of understanding that number. First, of course, is, really the significant growth in recent years, the lack of perhaps political will and prosecutorial capacity during previous times to address these issues, but also, I think, increased prosecutorial capacity of the various law enforcement agencies to identify but also prosecute these crimes. And similarly, I think with greater information sharing, capacity building, we will be able to, I think, enhance the ways in which both the United States and Taiwan, but working with other like-minded partners and allies, can really address this collective challenge.
So I think we are just at time. So I want to thank the audience for its wonderful questions. I want to thank TECO for hosting what I think was actually a frank event. I think we can say that without just using diplomatic speak. I want to thank Network 2020 and the two wonderful panelists. So let's give them a round of applause.